Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's Reddit Quickie from the subreddit HFY, called The Theseus, written by Legal. The link to the original will be down below, and as always, I hope that you enjoy. Vanguard Academy, Krasavova Primus, Premier Autocracy Officer Training School. Instructriarch Trasawaka glowered at her class as she often did, slowly tapping her disciplinary staff against the flat of her palm. She was not upset over the rowdy or disruptive class members. One did not make it this far into the autocracy without being able to quell unrest. But she had an issue finding out the best way to beat philosophy into her students. When she had first argued to add the course to the academy curriculum, she hadn't foreseen just how difficult that task would be. How did her human counterparts manage it was still wondering idly from time to time. Their methodology seemed to involve far less beating in general. Perhaps it had something to do with the mental fatigue and constant exercise. She looked into it. Pupil Ionic. She pointed her staff at one of the large chag at the back of the room. Their species had been added to the autocracy 3 centuries prior, due to their sturdy physique and aggressive nature. Their shoulders and heads encased in a thick bones riches, which gave them an exceptionally predatory edge on their home world, and made them ideal shock troops for the autocracy. But while Ionic didn't fear combat, he did gulp nervously as the instructriarch singled him out. What is the point of this class? Why do I bother to even attempt to jam the vast knowledge into your various suboptimal cranial voids? The pupil shifted in his seat for a moment. To give us insight to our greatest enemy? To correct the title, the most challenging foe so far. Ionic had learned that the instructriarch hated any one species being considered the greatest enemy, as it implied that they'd never overcome them to discover a worse enemy. The instructriarch slowly tapped her disciplinary staff against her hand once more before finally replying. A partial answer. Then, displaying her lightning speed, she raised her staff and struck the Ionic in across the head as the staff discharged an electrical shock straight through the bone plate, making a hiss in pain and clutch its head. For a partial beating. She finished, and slowly talked over the rows of desks as the other pupils eyed her warily. Anyone else? She queried. When pupil Rias raised his hand, she leveled the staff at him. His reptilian tongue flicked out into the air for a moment before he spoke. To adapt our thinking in such a way to better be prepared for future conflicts. To understand better how to change. The instructriarch nodded slowly at the civish. They'd been part of the autocracy almost as long as the Super Aurelius. Thanks to their long, thin forms and natural adaptive coloring, they were often used for the autocracy intelligence, not to mention as technicians and pilots. Not just how they change, but why. The instructriarch nodded and walked on in front of the class as she looked over the ranks once more. Would anyone like to say why the autocracy has been so successful? The pupil shifted a bit, and she noticed how many of them eyed the staff, so she turned and set it on the desk, signaling that it was at least now that she would not punish wrong answers. She wanted greater input. Unity, one ventured. Many united species have fallen to us. She counted easily. Diverse citizenry, another quickly added. Are we the only government made of more than a single species? She counted again. Strong central leadership, she heard. How many crowns rest on the Hall of Victory? She asked. A heavy militarized society, came the next guess. How many of your ancestors were brought into the fold due to their militancy? How many were militant but unworthy of citizenship? She said next. Extensive planning and intelligence operations. The instructriarch snorted at that as she heard another civilish pupil say that. One of the first lessons I taught you all was that no plan survives contact with the enemy. Have you forgotten that? She asked, and the pupil shifted nervously as he eyed the staff behind her, but she remained where she was, still waiting. Of all these things, when she heard that, she scanned the room and saw pupil Polyria with her hand raised. The Nospresso was proof that not all species worthy of citizenship had a large or menacing. With large eyes and a diminutive stature, the furred mammals had been underestimated by a great many other species. But they had survived their homeworld by being cunning and ruthless, which the autocracy admired. Once they'd been integrated, they had proven themselves to be extremely capable engineers and naval officers. All of these things the Instructriarch echoed. A great nation is not defined by a single attribute for very long before that strength can be turned against it. This is something that we know well. Fill the ranks with species who each bring their own strength and erase our weaknesses. Structure society around their strengths, and we shall have no counter in the galaxy's survival and prosperity. That is the core of the autocracy. So why, then, did our war with the humans go so disastrously? She noticed how the class shifted about nervously when she said that. Not all high-ranking officers within the autocracy liked to admit that the war was a disaster, but she was not so weak or afraid of admitting an error. As the students eyed the uniform that was represented with medals, commendations, and awards, they settled down a little before finally people listened. Another superilious, like her, raised a hand. Failure to change, failure to adapt. Failure to change, failure to adapt, the Instructriarch echoed. We had been victorious in every war for a millennia. What trouble would a single species cause us? A single, isolated and technologically inferior species, and so, with very little preparation, we attacked. And yet, as we pushed deeper into their territory, everything we thought we knew about their tactics and tech changed. By the time we'd finished creating comprehensive manuals about their military, we were already out of date. But how? With every planet we took, their forces looked relatively the same, yet by the end of the war, they had changed completely. A total overhaul of the military structure that would take us a decade, and other species longer, no doubt. So how did they manage it? This time she didn't expect any answer, and tapped a button on her desk to lower the lights and bring down a vid screen. This is perhaps my most significant discovery about the humans from my studies of their philosophy. Theseus' ship. She waved her hand at a diagram of the ancient human sailing ship. This has been part of their learning structure for thousands of years before even reaching the stars. That's how ingrained it is in their culture. They would change one piece of the ship at a time until every piece was no longer the original. The same ship, and yet an entirely new. To change constantly and yet remain the same, this is the trick that the humans have managed in society and military. With every battle they would change and adapt little things, tiny things, constantly, so that after several battles it was like fighting an entirely different foe. She paused then, as one of the Siverish raised the hand. Yes, people, Kuzi? But how could they change parts of the ship while they was underway? Wouldn't it take a significant time in dry dock for that? The mast, for example, couldn't be replaced while being used, could it? The Instructriarch frowned at that. The original idea involved sailing ships, but that's not what I'm focusing on, she tried to explain. Well, even modern starships, to adapt them in the void would be exceptionally dangerous, wouldn't it? Rias mentioned. It's not about changing parts of a starship in a void. Even humans can't do that, the Instructriarch explained. I'm not saying the entire human navy was changing parts of the ships between battles, though they did in small bits, but that isn't about that. What about one of their, planet munchers? The class looked back at Ionic, who slowly shrank back into his chair with a sudden attention. I believe you mean the World Eater class ship, the Instructriarch asked. This isn't about those either. They were all either destroyed in the war or dismantled as a condition of the ceasefire. But, in a way, they're a sign of the changes that I refer to. At the start of the war, the humans had adapted a much more sustainable method of resource acquisition, much like the autocracy. It's not as though they went from a sustainable resource collection to ships capable of dismantling and devouring whole planets overnight. But by the end of the war, their desperate defense and consuming so many resources, such things were necessary. Something that we had assumed entirely impossible before seeing it. This is how it works. Every little part changing constantly until the end result is a new, but each individual change is easy to accept. I'm sorry to correct you, Instructriarch, but didn't one World Eater technically escape into the deep spineward traverse? The instructriarch turned her head to the sudden correction and glared at pupil Carelia. After a moment, though, she sighed and closed her eyes, rubbing the side of her beak. Yes, technically one did escape, but considering the spineward traverse is an empty void at the edges of the galaxy, with no civilized presence to cut off from the newly formed Alliance territory, that the ship, like all humans, lost fleets succumbed to starvation, and fuel outages to be abandoned in the void. But then again, this isn't about that, the instructriarch stressed. Also, from what I've read, the ship you refer to in question was about the nature of the vessel. If every piece is replaced with a ship of the original or new, or if one were to use all of the replaced pieces to make a new ship, would the original be the other one? The class was quiet as Quirilla said that, reading from her database. What are you talking about? Who cares what's the original? What? Doesn't make any sense, the instructriarch clucked after a moment. What if the World Eater met up with the Lost Fleet and created a new vessel that could survive in the Traverse? Vincent asked, and the instructriarch Tessa Walker finally snapped. Enough, she cried out, her wings lifting up and spreading out to their full size as she grabbed her disciplinary staff once more and waved it at the class while they shrank back in their chairs. This is not an engineering class. This is not a real ship. This is how the humans adapt. Small, tiny changes that add up over time. This is a threat we faced. Not a slow, adapting foe that will follow the same tactics and strategy over time, but one that will constantly change. This is what I'm trying to teach you all. This has nothing to do with world eaters or actual ships. The instructriarch fumed and glared at the class. Most of them were quiet and watchful of a dominant display of plumage as very clear. But is the World Eater idea possible? Vincent asked, and the class quickly scooted their desks away as the instructriarch screeched out and brought her staff down on his head. Deep Spineward Traverse, System JX229. Once we're done with this panel, we've got to finish attaching the regulator unit, and then we can be back inside for lunch. Supposed to be food paste gamma today. Foreman Hitachi mentioned as the crew around him worked to weld, solder, and fastened depending on their job. Great, food space gamma, just fantastic, Jinx muttered as she was stuck out on the far arm of the work team Sierra. All we ever do is work on this damn ship. New solar panels, greenhouses, foundries. It never fricking stops. Frick, I don't even remember the last time that we got to step foot on a planet that we didn't just crack and consume. Across the arm from her, Matt chuckled softly and nudged the old man Deck with his elbow. Did I ever tell you the story about how the ship got its name? Old man Deck asked Matt carefully, turned his incoming sound on of the side of his helmet. Jesus H. Titty fucking Christ, old man. If you tell us that stupid freaking story one more goddamn time, I'm gonna straight up murder you. Jinx hissed out and pointed her multi-tool at him across the arm. But since his receiver was off, he didn't hear the threat. You see, there was an ancient Greek philosopher. It was as far as he got before Jinx screamed and threw her multi-tool at him. It struck him in the head and bounced off of his helmet harmlessly, spinning off into the void. All around him, the rest of the work team were laughing, but the foreman saw the tool in the distance. Jinx, that's coming out of your rations, you know, he called out. One of these days, old man, she pointed at Deck before shoving off of the arm to getting off of her multi-tool to grab it before it got too far. Isn't she going to stay a while and listen? Deck asked in confusion, and the others laughed and Matt turned his receiver back on. Oh yeah, Deck, she loves your stories. The multi-tool just slipped from her hand. The others laughed as the foreman just shook his head, and then he looked up at the massive ship that they were working on. To the bow was half a planet being broken apart and putting into the massive foundries inside the mouth of the ship. It was a shell more than a real ship, but it didn't change the fact that it was the largest spacefaring vessel humanity had ever made. Off to their starboard was the Flotilla Praetorian, Flotilla Vanguard and scouting for another system to consume. And Flotilla Heimdall was watching for the autocracy ships. One of these days, they'd have enough strength to strike back at their enemies. But for now, they stayed quiet, breaking apart barren worlds to build up their fleet. And once they were done overhauling every part of the ship, well, then they'd start over again. After all, work was never done on the Theseus. And that, my friends, is the end of this Reddit Quickie. I hope that you enjoyed. If you'd like to support the channel or the author, all the stuff is down below. And as always, I hope that you guys have a good one, and I'll see you in the next story. Cheers.